It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Miriam Cakes, Labour MP Chris Bryant, The Telegraph's Lucy Fisher and HuffPost's Paul Waugh. The Prime Minister's facing a backlash from some of his own MPs over the government's approach to China.
The grasping naivety of the Cameron-Osborne years still lingers on.
I am worried about designating China simply as a systemic challenge, given the terrible events in Hong Kong and Xinjiang.
Also on today's programme.
You're very popular.
What are you doing with my phone?
In the clamour for action after the killing of Sarah Everard, should more be done to teach boys to respect women and girls? We'll bring you Prime Minister's questions live at noon. And remember him. He's back in Parliament today.
Is that the reason why you were given the £45,000 pay rise?
No. So the media reports about me getting a pay rise after COVID are wrong.
Let's start with the government's publication of the catchily titled Integrated Review of Security, Defence, Development and Foreign Policy. It runs to over 100 pages, has taken over a year and sets out UK priorities until 2030, including issues like UK's relationship with China. Now, the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, in a leaked video call with staff in the Foreign Office, talked about trading relations that the UK should undertake. Let's have a look and a listen.
So I squarely believe we ought to be trading liberally around the world. If we restrict it to countries with ECHR level standards of human rights, we're not going to do many trade deals with the growth markets of the future.
Now, this was an exclusive. Of course, the HuffPost, Paul Waugh, is from the HuffPost, and we'll come to him in just a moment. But my question to all of you is, should the UK only trade with countries that meet the standards of the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights? Miriam?
Well, I think firstly, the Foreign Office has been clear that Raab's comments were taken out of context, and he went on to highlight the many interventions that the UK is making about some of the horrendous abuses that we've seen around the world. But I think, yes, we have to be prepared to trade with a wide range of countries. If we had the power to stop these human rights abuses right now, we would. The fact is we don't have the power, but we can have influence. And turning our backs and walking away from potential influential relationships with countries that have human rights abuses would be wrong. It would be meaningless. The best thing to do is to create those trading relationships that give us influence, but at the same time to never cease to highlight those issues and work towards resolving them with the countries involved.
Right, the same question to you, Chris. You were shaking your head. Chris, we can't hear you. Might you be on mute? Try again.
Rookie error, eh? Terribly sorry about that. Look, I just think that argument is terribly, terribly naive. The truth is that it's terribly difficult dealing with authoritarian regimes, yes, but I was struck yesterday by Boris Johnson in the House of Commons actually quoting Neville Chamberlain from 1938 about Czechoslovakia, about a foreign country that nobody knows anything about. The truth is, the clothes that we buy in shops in the UK should not be made by slave labour from Uyghur people in China who are suffering genocide. I think that's just a basic fundamental premise on which we should be proceeding. And my anxiety about the government is that they're so desperate to do more trade deals anywhere, anybody, that they forget that basically the whole ethos of the UK, surely in this era, must be that we are the country that upholds human rights.
Sure.
We are the country that fights for the rule of law.
Chris, my question was, should the UK only trade with countries that meet the standards of the European Convention on Human Rights?
Yes.
Right, OK. Lucy, is that position sustainable going forward? There'll be many people watching the programme that think, well, haven't we always traded to some extent with countries that don't have a particularly good track record on human rights?
Well, I think that's absolutely right, Joe. There's always been this element of realpolitik. Foreign policy is always governed by the tussle between values and interests. And as you point out, so far we do continue to trade with countries with questionable human rights records. Saudi Arabia is a great example. Even last month, when the new Biden administration sort of announced they would stop selling arms to Saudi amid concerns about them being used in Yemen, the UK hasn't taken that step. But again, Foreign Office officials would point out that they have a dual-pronged approach. At the one hand, trading with a country like Saudi. On the other hand, levying Magnitsky sanctions on those officials from Saudi Arabia who were involved with the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. It is really difficult to keep a balanced approach, but I think Dominic Raab will be making an interesting point in a speech at the Aspen Security Forum today, which is that forecasts show that the collective GDP of the world's autocracies are due to overtake the collective GDP of the world's democracies. So it's a growing slice of the pie that we would be closing ourselves off from if we never traded with autocratic regimes. But obviously it's very awkward to hear a foreign secretary use the sort of language he has in the past 24 hours.
I'll come back to you in a moment, Chris, but Paul, first of all, to the initial question.
Yeah, well, there's this phrase, classic Dom, isn't there? You've just shown Dominic Cummings giving evidence to Parliament. A classic Dom, in his case, was all about creating a controversy, like how much the NHS is going to get after Brexit, so you can get your message across. Well, there's a different kind of classic Dom we've seen, which is Dominic Raab. It's typical behaviour for this Foreign Secretary, because what he is, he's a former Foreign Office lawyer who does believe in human rights, does believe in civil liberties, but who broke with the FCO consensus about Europe. And when he became a Tory MP and a Brexiteer, what he's trying to get across is basically, as a Brexiteer, as a Brexit nation, we need to boost trade wherever we can across the globe. And I think that's what's really framed what was perhaps unfortunately phrased yesterday. He laid bare basically the position we're now in post-Brexit, which is we need to trade with as many countries as possible in this government's view. And the problem with that is, at the same time, you've got him as Foreign Secretary trying to boost the UK's leadership role on human rights across the world, whether it's in the G7 or wherever this year. And I think it's that tension that has been exposed in the last 24 hours.
Right. Well, Miriam, what do you say in response to that? Is global Britain, as Boris Johnson calls it, going to sacrifice, to some extent, standards over human rights in other countries when it comes to the issue of trade?
No, it isn't. And I go back to my former point, which is that we aren't a power in the sense that we once were, and it certainly wouldn't want to exert power, but we do want influence. And you don't gain influence by walking away from relationships. Now, clearly there are some horrendous human rights abuses going on in the world, and Chris mentioned earlier the Bayes Committee report that's out today, and certainly the government should look at that. And there's a very strong argument that businesses shouldn't be using in supply chains that slave labour. But I think the opportunity here for Britain in this new integrated review, our new relationship with the world, is to spread our influence further across the globe. And trading relationships is a great way to do that.
Right. I mean, Chris, over the past decade, Chinese investment has been worth more than £50 billion flowing into Britain's economy. Can the UK afford to turn down further Chinese investment?
Can the UK afford to do what we did in the 1930s, which is appease authoritarian regimes? Why on earth is the British government refusing to use its Magnitsky sanctions against Carrie Lam in Hong Kong at the moment, or against Chinese officials? Why are they doing everything in their power to try and prevent Parliament coming up with the definition of genocide, which is quite clearly what is happening now in Xinjiang province in China? Why does the British government endlessly refuse to tackle the dirty Russian money in the British banking system, which, and for that matter, in the British overseas territories as well? It just feels like Boris Johnson is Neville Chamberlain, not the Winston Churchill that he would like to pretend.
Well, let Miriam respond.
I think it is possibly fair to say that in the past we have been naive to China's intentions, and that has led to us becoming very dependent on the Chinese in various areas. But I think this review is a line in the sand and actually saying, look, this is problematic. And some of the things the government has done recently, so for example, the Telecommunications Security Bill, where we're actively looking to remove Huawei
we had to force them. We had to force
infrastructure. I think I just said, Chris, perhaps we have been naive in the past, but this is a fresh understanding of the potential threat that China poses to the world. But walking away from China and any relationship from China is not the right answer either. And we have to tread these not black and white.
But nobody's advocating that. It's just that what we're doing is we've identified the threat and we've said, and we're not going to do anything about it. That is the 1930s all over again.
No, we're not doing anything about it. And I think, as I've just said, one example about the Telecommunications and Security Bill, but it's going to take time to reverse a position and reach a new stance where we are challenging China in an effective way.
Right. Well, it's not just Chris and the Labour Party who are critical, Miriam. Let's listen to a little bit more of the Conservative MP Julian Lewis, who's chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee in the Commons yesterday. Here he is.
Now, though there are strong analytical aspects to this review, it's suggested on pages 62 to 3 that our adversary, Communist China, quotes, is an increasingly important partner in tackling global challenges like pandemic preparedness, if you please, and that we want deeper trade links and more Chinese investment in the UK. Doesn't that unfortunately demonstrate that the grasping naivety of the Cameron-Osborne years still lingers on in some departments of state?
Lucy, Julian Lewis referring there to the way the Chinese regime was embraced by the previous government, David Cameron and George Osborne. How much of a threat is opposition from within the Conservative Party itself to the government?
Well, I think it's very threatening to the government. We've seen the China hawks on the Tory backbenches be incredibly organised in the past 2 years, inflicting a number of defeats on the government over Huawei and rebellion over Huawei, and most recently the back and forth on the trade bill over the genocide amendment, where Tory backbenchers would like to see powers handed to English courts to make genocide determinations on countries that the UK enters into trade deals with. So I think there is a lot to be concerned about for the government, and we definitely haven't heard the end of this yet.
Paul?
Yeah, I think the Prime Minister is certainly worried about the China hawks on his backbenches. There were several of them that spoke yesterday on the integrated review statement in the Commons. I think the real reason here they'll be nervous is that for the first time, the Labour Party is united in being very, very hawkish itself on China and on Russia. And those twin threats, suddenly that idea that somehow Labour is soft on defence and soft on foreign policy, the whole paradigm has changed under Keir Starmer. And I think a lot of Tory backbenchers have seized that opportunity, that there's leverage when it comes to legislation and other pressure within the House that wasn't there before.
Right, I'm going to welcome Alan Smith, SNP MP and spokesperson for the party on foreign affairs. Welcome to you, Alan, because we're going to turn and talk about Boris Johnson's plan to increase the size or the number of the UK's nuclear weapons stockpile, which campaigners have said violates international law. The Integrated Defence Review said the UK would be lifting the cap on its nuclear arsenal by 40% to 260 warheads. Paul, does this, in your mind, amount to a breach of the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons?
Well, it's clear that there are many people who think that there is a real risk of that, and that it's contradictory to, on the one hand, say, as it does say clearly in the document, that you were in favour of non-proliferation, and at the same time to lift the cap. Now, the logic behind it is always to keep your enemies guessing and to not let them know exactly what we've got. And there was a really interesting line in the document which suggested that we could retaliate with nuclear strikes in return for non-nuclear actions such as cyber or biological attacks. Now, that's made explicit for the first time. And there are some people, Tobias Ellwood, the Tory chairman of the Defence Select Committee, who think that went slightly too far, and that the Parliament itself should be consulted before any such change in strategy.
Right, Miriam, what do you say about that?
Well, I think we would all agree that we wish nuclear weapons didn't exist, but the fact is that they do. And it is a deterrent. That is what it's there for. Of course, no sane power would ever seek to use those in almost any circumstances. But if we go back to the China point, I mean, China is a nuclear power. If we don't have a deterrent that is a deterrent, then what's the point? We need a balance of powers for a peaceful world. So, you know, of course, I wish nuclear weapons didn't exist, but they do. We've got them. And so we have to make sure it's a credible deterrent. And that's what the integrated review is all about, is making sure that it continues to be a credible deterrent to keep peace in the world.
Right. Well, do you agree with that, Alan? This is about the evolving security environment.
No, that's just garbage. If your stated aim is to cut nuclear weapons in the world, increasing nuclear weapons at home seems a really curious thing to do. And I've actually commissioned some research from the House of Commons Library on the legal point, because I think it's really quite arguable. But what's clear this week, you know, let's deal in facts that exist. The UK has confirmed that it is cutting aid to the poorest in the world and increasing nuclear weapons at home. The UK is going in exactly the wrong direction, and we really need to try and turn it back to a sensible policy.
Miriam?
Well, is it good for world peace to have an imbalance in nuclear power? No, it isn't. It's extremely dangerous, and that's what this is about.
Alan?
The Tories are a pro-nuclear party, and I think that's a matter of great regret, and I look forward to them getting off of Scotland's soil.
Right, but the Clyde Naval Base, where the Trident system operates from, supports a lot of jobs, doesn't it, Alan, in Scotland? As you said, you want to get rid of Trident. What would happen to those jobs?
Well, the nuclear jobs will be moved, but we'll repurpose the base towards conventional defence. And Scotland's a very strategically located country. We'll be a full, enthusiastic NATO partner in terms of cooperating on defence. But we're very clear in our world vision. We are not a former imperial power. We're a North Atlantic state that will be serious about our international commitments, serious about mutual defence and solidarity. But we won't feel the need to hold on to these weapons for some imperial grandeur. It's not as if we can actually use them without the US giving us the permission to anyway. It's farcical.
Right. Well, Chris, what's your response generally, though, to the increase? Because although the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons does commit the government to gradual nuclear disarmament under international law, it does say it's gradual, and the current security threat means that we should continue. The government obviously feels it should be increased.
Two big points. First of all, I completely support the UK retaining a nuclear presence. I think it should be the minimum we need. And I'm very sceptical. This is my second big point. I'm very sceptical about the government's argument for a significant increase in the number of warheads that we need. But I do support us having a nuclear deterrent. My biggest anxiety, however, about this is that I think the government wants us all to have a row about this rather than focus on the real issues in terms of the number of people we're going to have in the British Army. I think nearly 7,000 people under force at the moment, and I can foresee that we're going to be even more diminished in the future. And I think we still need traditional forces. Secondly, we've still got British personnel using tanks that were introduced in 1962, which is considerably older than you, Jo, and round about the same age as me. And I'm a bit clapped out. So, frankly, I don't think we should.
What are you trying to say about me?
You, Jo, are an elegant.
Yes, all right.
Anyway, but my bigger and in the end, I think the government fails to understand its own logic, because it says that Russia is a problem because of the hybrid warfare that it's engaged in with the UK, and yet it refuses even to investigate what happened in previous general elections and referendums, even though the Intelligence and Security Committee said that there was a major issue here to interrogate. In the United States of America, they've already said that the Russians tried to interfere against Biden. Right,
Miriam, I'll just get you briefly to respond because I want to move on to talk to Alan Smith about some other things. Miriam.
Well, I think, as one of you have already said, the integrated review is a huge document, I think 114 pages. So we can pick out different parts of it and discuss them, but they are all different pieces in a jigsaw of a new approach that combines security, defence and foreign policy for the first time. And I think the point is that we need all these strands to have a strategy for global Britain, that to be open to the world, we also need to be secure. So we can pick and choose pieces to talk about, but it's the review as a whole that is the policy going forward.
All right, let's move on. We're going to talk about... Right, hang on. We're going to talk about the way the Scottish Government handled allegations against the former First Minister Alex Salmond. The Conservative MP David Davis got up in the House of Commons and used parliamentary privilege to make some further accusations, which the Scottish Government has denied. Let's have a listen to what he said.
I have it on good authority that there exists, from the 6th of February 2018, an exchange of messages between civil servants Judith McKinnon and Barbara Allison, suggesting the First Minister's Chief of Staff is interfering in the complaints process against Alex Salmond. The investigating officer complained, and I quote, "Liz interference v bad." I assume that means very bad. If true, this suggests the Chief of Staff had knowledge of the Salmond case in February, not in April.
Alan, what's your response?
David Davis hiding behind parliamentary privilege over a matter of sexual abuse allegations, I think really is not a good look for him personally. But these are serious allegations. But even by his own words there, he said he assumes, and if this is true, now this is something that's been rumbling away in Scottish politics, perhaps not UK, for a long while. And a lot of allegations have been made, a lot of conspiracy theories have been thrown into the mix on this. But I really have to say, where there's an allegation made, we need to deal with it. And we are dealing with it. That's why we've got 2 live inquiries going forward within Holyrood and the independent Hamilton inquiry into the ministerial code.
Yes.
But this is just another series of allegations which are utterly unsubstantiated.
Right, and you've said that we need to wait for the reviews, which of course we do, the outcomes. But the Scottish Government has already admitted acting unlawfully in the way it handled the allegations against Alex Salmond. That was in a court case back in 2019. So you already accept that some mistakes have been made?
Last time I was on this programme, I accepted some mistakes had been made, which is why we're having a committee of inquiry, the Scottish Parliament, looking into all of this stuff to see what lessons need to be made, because clearly there were mistakes. But what we're seeing with David Davis's stuff, and I don't decry his own motives in doing this, but it's a series of allegations which have been made but not substantiated. And we are going through a process of inquiry into this. And I really think using parliamentary privilege in the way that it's been used on a matter as sensitive and complex as this is really not how we should be doing business. I
know I've put this to you before, but will Nicola Sturgeon resign, Alan Smith, if she's found to have broken the ministerial code?
And I have to give you the same answer. There's an inquiry ongoing into the Committee of Inquiry at Holyrood, looking into the way that the government dealt with the actual investigation.
Yes.
And then there's the independent inquiry into whether or not a ministerial code was breached. And surely it's only common sense to let due process run its course and see what the conclusions actually are. And then I'll happily come back on the programme and discuss it with you then.
Yes, because, I mean, the SNP called for the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, to resign last autumn after an official report said she had broken the ministerial code, which the Prime Minister dismissed. And are you showing double standards there if it comes to it with Nicola Sturgeon, that she would have to resign immediately if she was found to have broken the ministerial code?
Well, sure, the important thing there is we waited to call for the resignation until the report was actually published and we saw what the offence and the gravity of it actually was. I mean, come on, play fair. Let's see what the inquiry actually says. The inquiry is being seriously undertaken and in private. So the Hamilton inquiry has access to all the papers and all of this stuff. So this is being properly ventilated in private, as it should be. But the conclusions will be public, and let's wait until we see what the conclusions actually are.
Right. What do you think the impact is, Alan, in terms of the public's view of all of this and public support? Because several polls in a row now, carried over the last 4 weeks, show a majority of the Scottish people supporting the union. Now, this turnaround comes after a very long run of polls, which we've discussed in the past, showing support for independence. And actually, today, there is a major new opinion poll that says that support for remaining part of the UK has increased to as much as 57%. What's going on?
There's a lot of things going on. There's Brexit, there's COVID, there's the economic uncertainty. We're all in lockdown. I think there's a febrile atmosphere to politics generally. But what we're seeing with the run of pro-independence polls was before a campaign was even starting. We're coming up to the Scottish Parliament election campaign getting underway in earnest for May the 6th. That's going to be the next big electoral event. Polls fluctuate, and there's a lot of stuff in the mix with this. I'm not denying that the focus of the media, particularly Scottish politics, on the Salmond inquiry has been, I think, a sideshow to the main issues that the people of Scotland want us to be talking about, but they're hearing an awful lot about it. But I have to say as well, all the allegations that have been made, Nicola Sturgeon gave 8 hours of evidence to the Holyrood Committee. That's more than Tony Blair spent in front of the Chilcot inquiry into the war in Iraq. We are doing this seriously. And my party had an influx of 10,000 plus new members on the back of that really honest, really focused response. So there's a lot of things in the mix in Scotland right now.
Alan, thank you very much for joining us. I just want to get a reaction from Lucy and Paul to those polls and the turnaround that's shown. Polls are polls, of course. But Lucy, what do you think's going on?
Well, it's a very interesting topic, and, you know, the intrigue and infighting, eye-popping sort of soap opera has, you know, had a huge amount of attention south of the border in England. It seems to have dominated the media in Scotland. One can only expect that to have an impact on the polls, and I'm very interested to see what happens on May the 6th in the Holyrood elections to the Scottish Nationalist Party's vote.
Paul?
I think that's an important point Lucy made. I mean, the public in Scotland may well sort these into 2 different categories, which is, one is my support for the Scottish Government, how well it's been doing or not in the pandemic, and you'll see the rollout of that in the Holyrood elections. A lot of people think that actually SNP is still on course for a very big majority there, or certainly a majority, which would transform the way London has to react to the whole independence question. And there's a separate issue of independence itself, and whether or not this row has weakened it. It appears that it has in the short term, but a lot of it may well just come down to what happens on May the 6th. And if Nicola Sturgeon does get a decent majority, then she can claim she's got a mandate to push independence further.
All right, let's leave it there, because we're going to talk from the course of the last week. There's been a national conversation about violence against women and girls and how society can do more to prevent it. This is following the killing of Sarah Everard. In today's Times, we can just show our viewers, Policing Minister Kit Malthouse has suggested there should be more focus on sex and relationship education. The headline is, Sarah Everard, give boys lessons on how to respect women and girls, says the Minister, Kit Malthouse. I think we can show you a little bit more. I think we always have to pay attention to the way we bring up our kids. This has been a constant theme throughout my life about what role models, what kids understand about relationships. He goes on to say that it may be that we need to think about what PSHE, which is personal, social, health and economic education, includes about, for example, the way people are treated in the street and the way women and girls are contemplated in the public realm. Now, he acknowledges that there is this programme, the PSHE programme in schools, and over the last decade, the government has also backed TV and online campaigns aimed at young people. Let's just take a look at this from 2013.
You're very popular.
What are you doing with my phone?
You wearing that? You don't want to look cheap, do you? Now, you're not going to make a fool of yourself tonight, are you? I love you too much to let you do that.
Abuse in relationships isn't always physical. For information and help, search This Is Abuse.
Now, that was the government working with the producers of the soap Hollyoaks to raise awareness among young people of what abusive relationships look like. But now there are calls for more to be done. Let's talk to Kat Banyard, the director of UK Feminista, an organisation that works with schools and teachers to promote gender equality in the classroom. Welcome to you. What's being done already to tackle misogyny and sexist behaviours in school?
In short, not enough. Some schools have taken the lead and taken action on this, but unfortunately they've suffered from very little support over the years and very little political leadership. Really, what we need to see is strategic long-term action in schools, which is led by the government and which is supported by the Department for Education and Ofsted, because unfortunately one lesson, one assembly, one teacher cannot fix this alone. What we need to see practically in schools happening is what's called a whole school approach, whereby a strategic long-term action plan is put in place to tackle sexism in its different forms, and also in terms of teacher training. What we need to see is training on how to tackle sexism being made a core and compulsory part of all training for new teachers, so that a new generation of teachers going into the classroom is equipped with the tools and the knowledge on how to tackle this issue.
Right.
I'd say Ofsted have an important role to play, because they can reward and incentivise effective action in schools to tackle sexism. But how can they do that if they don't know what they're looking for? So every single Ofsted inspector should receive training on how schools can combat sexism and sexual harassment.
So you're talking about a strategic approach that wouldn't be sort of separated off or hived off in specific lessons in the way they are now, but you want to somehow see that filtered into all classes.
Exactly. We conducted research with the National Education Union, which found that sexual harassment, sexist language, gender stereotyping are commonplace and rife in schools. And the point is that violence against women doesn't appear out of nowhere. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists because of this wider culture of sexism, of sexist comments being commonplace in schools. So in order to end violence against women and girls, we need to tackle that wider culture. And that means systematic action throughout schools, throughout the education system, not just one lesson, not just one message.
Right, Kat, thank you very much for joining us. Let's go to the panel. Miriam, you were a teacher before becoming an MP. How practical is that?
Well, it's certainly true that schools need to address this, and I think the vast majority of teachers are excellent role models themselves in this area, and clearly there will be more to do. But I would just make the point that by the time a child is 16, they've spent just 14% of their time in school and 86% of their time at home. And although feminism has achieved an awful lot for women in the public sphere over recent decades in terms of equality in the workplace and being promoted, being respected, you know, we have achieved a lot there. Actually, how much have we achieved in the private sphere? And although, you know, the death of Sarah Everard is shocking, we have to acknowledge that most violence and abuse of women takes place in private, in domestic situations. And so where do children get their attitudes? Where do boys get their attitudes of how to treat women? And predominantly it's from the family, it's from the home, it's how dad treats mum. And, you know, we have to take a long, hard look at ourselves as a society and say, have we achieved so much for women in public, but not in private? And I think we've got some serious questions to ask there about the role of the family and the role of the media and the internet, which are two, you know, enormous issues to tackle.
Chris, should schools be taking this on?
Yes, they should. Of course they should. And
more than they do already.
Well, the very first attempt I made at private members' legislation was about proper sex and relationship education in all schools. Unfortunately, now we don't have a national curriculum anymore because so many schools fall without, you know, outside the kind of national boundaries. So it is much more difficult. I think we also need a proper youth service, and that's been one of the things that has been completely wiped off the face of most local authorities' budgets for the last 11 years. It is a whole culture thing. Miriam is absolutely right about that, because I don't know how many murders I've seen of women on television in dramas. We must be the first generation that have seen so many murders in dramatized on television, and all that. I'm not saying that people then repeat those. I just wonder what that's done to our sensitivity. That's all.
Right.
And I think the other thing. Sorry, just one other thing. I've only ever had to worry 3 or 4 times in my life about going home late at night. I'm really struck by how many of my female friends say that that is their worry every single time. I just note that lots of local authorities have had their budgets cut so dramatically in the last 11 years that they've switched off half of their street lighting at night. Maybe we need to look at that as well.
Right. Paul, listening to this is a conversation about changing culture. We've spent a lot of time on this programme this week talking about the criminal justice system, about sentencing and conviction rates, and we'll probably talk about that after Prime Minister's questions. Is this the best way to try and have a cultural change in terms of the attitudes of boys and men and boys while they're at school in terms of the way they treat women?
Well, I think Miriam made an excellent point, which is ultimately this comes down to how boys view the way women are treated within the home and outside the home. But that's why I think making the sex relationship education compulsory last year in English schools, as it was for the first time ever, was such a big step forward. The only way you're going to change this long term is if you educate children who obviously are seeing the worst abuses at home and in the school, and they can see an alternative worldview. And I think it's really significant. Politics does matter. I know that Yvette Cooper was pushing for compulsion on sex and relationship education since the early 2010s, and it was Michael Gove and ironically Theresa May who dragged their feet on that. Finally, it was introduced after Theresa May became Prime Minister. But now, there is a chance for some real progress.
Right. Lucy, what do you make of the idea that teachers may ask, I suppose, why the responsibility is assumed to be theirs?
Well, I think some teachers may ask that, but clearly, there needs to be a standard across the nation. I personally was glad to hear Kit Malthouse, the policing minister, suggest there should be more teaching for boys, but I think not only for boys, for girls too, to be, handed the tools to resist and call out sexist comments. In the wake of Sarah Everard's, tragic and shocking murder, we've heard, other stories about the sort of sexual harassment, abuse, sexual bullying in schools, a rape culture across the UK. And I think both boys and girls need more help in schools to understand that and reject that culture.
Right, Kat, a final word from you.
Just say...
Oh, yes. Oh, Kat, I'm going to go to Kat first.
Say...
All right, go on, Chris, then. All right, you've come in. Go on.
The youth service. Lots of kids don't relate through school. They may have a difficult time at home. They need alternative role models in their lives, and there are no youth services left to speak of. We really need to reinvent that.
Kat?
If the government is serious about tackling violence against women and challenging harmful attitudes to young people, it will implement legislation adopted by Parliament in 2017, making it a crime for pornography websites to expose children to pornography. They recently said they're going to repeal that legislation, and that is a child protection scandal. They need to implement that legislation now.
Kat, thanks very much for joining us, and of course we'll be following any developments that come about. I'd like to welcome Laura Kuenssberg to the programme, the BBC's political editor. And Laura, we might as well just continue on what we were discussing yesterday a little bit more, and that was the Hartlepool, or is, I should say, the Hartlepool by-election in the heart of what's known as Labour's Red Wall, or perhaps former Red Wall. How important is this by-election going to be in terms of a test of Keir Starmer's leadership?
Well, it could be a very, very interesting one. Now, Hartlepool was one of the seats that Labour managed to hold on to when the Tories were sort of gobbling up all sorts of parts of the country where they previously hadn't managed to gain seats in the general election. So it was one of the last kind of standing posts in the kind of seats where the Tories might have come through. And in that context, it will be very important to see how Keir Starmer does here.
And we're just showing pictures here of Mike Hill, who is, or has resigned, I should say, amid sex harassment allegations.
And it is, it is the first test, not just though for Keir Starmer, but also the first test in this Parliament for the government too. The last 12 months have been so extraordinary. People have suffered in all sorts of ways, and the Tories will be very hopeful and they will have a good old go at trying to get in there. But also there's the added dynamic of the Brexit party here. So they did extremely well in that part of the country. They managed to split some of that vote off. So where do those voters go now we've actually left the European Union? It's quite unclear where all these jigsaw pieces will actually end up fitting. But I think it's not just a test for Keir Starmer, it's a test for the government as well. But it is more acute for Labour because of the sort of rumblings about whether or not his leadership is really being able to kind of land punches in the way that his supporters hoped.
Chris, what's your feeling about it?
So I'm not very good at... I know I look like Mystic Meg, but I'm not much of an predictor of events. All I would say is I really hope Labour wins the seat.
Funny that.
Well, all right, but I'm not a commentator. I'm a player in this.
Yes, but I think
say that.
All right, well, let me be more specific. In terms of questions about Keir Starmer's leadership.
Question to a politician. Because, look, let me just say why I think people in Hartlepool should vote Labour, which is that we have a terribly corrupt government doling out vast amounts of money to its cronies to run contracts, who have lots of Tory allies who have enriched themselves during the pandemic, lots of badly made decisions. Many people died who need not have died because of the failed decisions by Boris Johnson. And on top of that, they've just wasted money, £37 billion on test and trace, which didn't even do the job properly.
Miriam?
That's why people should vote Labour.
Miriam?
Well, I could pick apart all of Chris's points, obviously, but you know, as a Conservative MP in a red wall seat, what was a Labour seat, the issues that came up on the doorstep back in 2019, many of those have changed substantially. Brexit, Corbyn, you know, whether we could deliver leaving the EU. So it will be very interesting to see what happens. But you know, I very much hope that people look at the situation in the round and, you know, yes, it's been a horrendous year for the whole country, for the whole world. But the vaccination programme just shows how, you know, effective government can be when government gets things right. And certainly talking to my own constituents, they very much appreciate that the government has had a very tough year, but they're supportive of what we're trying to do to support the NHS and save lives. So we shall see. We haven't got a candidate yet. It's going to be very different kind of campaigning. We won't be able to bus huge numbers of people up to the constituency because of restrictions, but let's wait and see.
Right, well, Paul, you wrote about this overnight. Do I hear the words expectation management coming into play?
Yeah, on all sides, obviously. But I do think, you know, Labour obviously should be winning and holding on to a seat like this, like Hartlepool. It is going to be a test for Keir Starmer. Peter Mandelson, who used to be the MP, famously, warned today in the Times that actually this was it's an unpredictable place, but the people defy expectations themselves. I think he made a very valid point when he warned Keir Starmer that actually he's got to show that Labour's under new management are not just in part of some kind of timeshare, was the phrase he used. In other words, not some attempt to go back to the soft left ways, not just of Jeremy Corbyn, but Ed Miliband. And I think that's Starmer's real challenge in Hartlepool. Just what kind of new leadership is he offering? If he wins, he'll get some momentum. If he wins some, you know, a couple of hundred council seats, he'll get some momentum. And I think that's really the game for him, which is the first real test of his leadership. And the polls obviously have been variable, but those are going to be real votes at the real ballot box in May 6th.
Right, well, we started the programme talking about one Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary. We're going to end this part of the programme having a conversation about Dominic Cummings, a different Dominic, because he's back in Parliament.
So there was popcorn watching for political hacks this morning as he was appearing at the Science and Technology Committee. Now, they had asked him to appear to talk narrowly about this new agency, ARIA, which is meant to be this sort of incredible scientific agency that the government wants to put in place, modelled on the Manhattan Project and actually how, you know, America came up with all sorts of scientific innovations on behalf of the state. But surprise ye not, they ended up tiptoeing to some territory that is politically more awkward for the government. First off, he wasted no time in revealing how, in his view, he kind of dictated terms to the Prime Minister about whether he was going to go and work with him in the first place. He said the Prime Minister had been to see him in his living room and he said, I'll come and work with you if you promise me you'll get Brexit done. If you
just in case we've forgotten who was really in charge.
Yeah, well, exactly. If you promise there'll be loads of money for science. But he also had a pop at Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary. He described the Department of Health as a smoking ruin in the early stages of the pandemic over PPE procurement. And he also talked about his version of actually how what we were reporting on yesterday, that the vaccines programme had been managed in a very different way to kind of traditional business being done in Whitehall.
Well, I think we have a clip of that. Let's have a listen to Dominic Cummings.
In spring 2020, you had a situation where Department for Health was just a sort of smoking ruin in terms of procurement and PPE and all of that. You had serious problems with the funding bureaucracy for therapeutics on COVID. So that was the kind of context for it. Patrick Wallenstein came to Number 10 and said, this shouldn't be run out of the Department for Health. We should create a separate task force.
Well, Lucy, what do you make of the words smoking ruin by Dominic Cummings there?
Well, he knows how to lob a grenade into Westminster, doesn't he? No surprise to me to hear him give his typically robust views on how things were run. I think that will have us all talking for some time, but also we'll see sort of people questioning his role and you know, his sort of evasion of taking any responsibility himself. But yeah, I'm interested to see what Matt Hancock says about the suggestion that the Department of Health, the vaccine rollout was taken away from the department, the suggestion being that it couldn't be trusted with it.
Right. Well, what do you make of that, Miriam?
Well, he hasn't lost the knack of making headlines, has he?
And his substantive claim?
I haven't had chance, I'm afraid, to look at his evidence in full.
But just the bit that you've heard there talking about the Department of Health.
His reflections are going to be very important because he was there in the thick of it at the start of the pandemic. And I think, the comment about how the vaccination programme has been run so successfully but so differently to past projects is very important. And there's clearly some learning to do about the differences between those two processes so that we can, do things better in future. So his evidence is very valid and we should listen to it. But as always, he will be a controversial figure.
Is government better with or without him?
Well, I'm afraid I am a humble backbencher and I am not, party to those decisions that are made at the top. But I think he contributed an awful lot. But it was probably a right time for him to go when he did leave.
Laura, Miriam says he was there. Well, he was more than just there, wasn't he? Instrumental. And I think we heard also, just before I came onto the programme, that he will give evidence, he said, to any inquiry. Of course, we don't know when that's going to be.
We don't, but he has already agreed to give evidence to an inquiry taking place in Parliament, which is being run by the Health and Select Committees jointly. I think that will be sometime in May when they will talk more fully about the COVID response. But one of the other points that I think it was very obvious that he wanted to make, he said there had to be an urgent, hard look in this building, referring to Parliament, about what happened and what went wrong. Very interesting, given how some members of the opposition and various other figures have been calling for quite some time for a proper inquiry. The Prime Minister and his team have always publicly said, oh, not now, we've got to get through this. Interesting to see Dominic Cummings, controversial though he is, say, actually, it has to happen straight away.
Right, would you welcome that, Chris?
Yes, there must be a judge-led inquiry, and I think that should start fairly soon, not least because otherwise people will be losing bits and pieces of evidence and their memory will become more faulty. Can I just say about Dominic Cummings, I think 3 more reasons to vote Labour in Hartlepool. Okay. First of all,
this is not a party election broadcast, and unfortunately for you, it looks though, I'm afraid, as if it's time for Prime Minister's questions. But thank you to all of you.
Number 1, sir. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure colleagues from across the House will want to join me in wishing everyone a very happy St Patrick's Day. I was delighted to visit Northern Ireland last week, where I was able to thank military and emergency response teams for their brilliant work throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Sam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a decade ago, GSK announced a £350 million investment in my constituency, which would have led to 1,000 jobs. In 2017, they reneged on that, and a few weeks ago, they announced they were closing their business altogether. We've gone from the very real prospect of having 1,500 high-paying, high-skilled farmer jobs in my constituency to the risk of having none by 2025. Will my right honourable friend agree to meet with me and throw the weight of the government behind efforts to make sure that GSK does the right thing by my constituents and delivers for some very worried people?
Yes.
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend very much, and I want to express my deepest sympathy to all those in Ulverston affected by these job losses, and to say that I will certainly meet with him. I believe that bioscience is one of the great growth areas for this country in the future, and I am determined that Barrow and Furness should take part in that boom along with everywhere else, as well as other high technologies.
Right, let's come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in his comments about St Patrick's Day? My thoughts, and I'm sure those across the whole of the House, are with the family and friends of Sarah Everard, who will be suffering unspeakable grief. There are 5 words that will stick with us for a very long time. She was just walking home. Sometimes a tragedy is so shocking, it demands both justice and change. The Stephen Lawrence case showed the poison of structural and institutional racism. The James Bolger case made us question the nature of our society and the safety of our children. Now the awful events of the last week have lifted a veil on the epidemic of violence against women and girls. This must also be a watershed moment to change how we as a society treat women and girls and how we prevent and end sexual violence and harassment. I believe that if we work together, we can achieve that. And the questions I ask today are in that spirit. So first, does the Prime Minister agree that this must be a turning point in how we tackle violence against women and girls?
Mr. Speaker, yes, I do. And I associate myself fully with the remarks that the Right Honourable Gentleman has made about the appalling murder of Sarah Everard. And I'm sure that those emotions are shared in this House and around the country. And that event has triggered a reaction that I believe is wholly justified and understandable. And of course, we in government are doing everything that we can. We're investing in the Crown Prosecution Service, trying to speed up the law. We're changing the law on domestic violence and many, many other things. But I think that he is right, frankly, that unless and until we have a change in our culture that acknowledges and understands that women currently do not feel they are being heard, we will not fix this problem. And that is what we must do. We need a cultural and social change in attitudes to redress the balance, Mr. Speaker, and that is what I believe all politicians must now work together to achieve.
Keir Starmer.
Can I thank the Prime Minister for that answer? In that spirit, can I turn to the practical challenges we face if we are collectively to rise to this moment? The first challenge, Mr. Speaker, is that many, many women and girls feel unsafe on our streets, particularly at night. What's needed is legal protection. And that's why we've called for a specific new law on street harassment and also for toughening the law on stalking. Both, I think, are absolutely vital if we're going to make meaningful change in the everyday experiences of women and girls. So can the Prime Minister commit to take both of these measures forward?
Mr. Speaker, we're always happy to look at new proposals. What we're already doing is introducing tougher sanctions on stalkers, or that's already been brought in, and we're bringing in new measures to make the streets safer. Of course, that's the right thing to do, Mr. Speaker. Last night there was a bill before the House on police crime and sentencing, which did a lot to protect women and girls, which did a lot to protect women and girls, and it would have been good in a cross-party way, Mr. Speaker, to have had the support of the opposition.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I'll come to last night's bill later, but it did say a lot more about protecting statues than it did about protecting women. But let me, if I may, given the gravity of the situation, continue in the spirit so far. And I thank the Prime Minister for his answer. The next challenge, practical challenge, is that many, many women and girls who are subjected to sexual violence do not feel confident to come forward and report what has happened to them. 9 out of 10 don't do so. We have to improve the support that's provided for victims. The Victims Commissioner published a report last month with 32 recommendations about this. This week, Labour produced a detailed survivor support plan. And 5 years ago, I introduced a private member's bill with cross-party support for a victims' law to give legally enforceable rights to victims. The Shadow Victims Minister, my honourable friend from Hove, has tabled a similar victims' bill that's before Parliament now. It's ready to go. All it needs is political will to act. So will the Prime Minister commit now, not just to the idea of a victims' law, which I think he does support, but to a tight timetable, ideally 6 months or so, to actually implement such a law?
Prime Minister.
As I say, Mr. Speaker, we're very happy to look at new proposals from all sides of the House on this issue, and that's why we're conducting an end-to-end review of the law on rape and how it works, and investing in the criminal justice system to speed up cases and give women and girls the confidence that they need. And I think that the point he makes about victims and their need to feel confident in coming forward is absolutely right. And that's why we've put £100 million so far into the services for dealing with violence against women and girls, particularly independent domestic violence advisors, independent sexual violence advisors, Mr. Speaker. I don't pretend that these are the entire solution. They are part of the solution, but it is also vital, Mr. Speaker, that we have long-term cultural, societal change to deal with this issue.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I agree with the Prime Minister on that last point. Can I gently remind him that for 10 years this government has been promising a victims' law? I think it's been in his party's last 3 manifestos. It still hasn't materialised. We don't, Prime Minister, need more reviews, consultation strategies. The conversations our Shadow Minister is having with government, constructive conversations, are exactly the same conversations as I had 5 years ago, constructive conversations. We just need now to get on with it. But let me press on with the practical challenges, because the next challenge is this, that for many, many women and girls who do come forward to report sexual violence, no criminal charges are brought. Only 1.5% of rapes reported to the police lead to a prosecution. Put the other way, 98.5% of reported rapes don't lead to a prosecution. That's a shocking statistic. I do appreciate that efforts are being made to improve the situation. But can the Prime Minister tell us what is he going to do about this, not in a few years' time, not next year, but now?
Prime Minister.
He's entirely right, Mr. Speaker, in the sense that I agree with him. One of the first things I said when I became Prime Minister was that I believed that the prosecution rates for rape were a disgrace in this country, and we need to sort it out. And yes, that's why we're investing in confidence-building measures such as ISVAs and IDVAs, and investing in the CPS, and trying to speed up the process of the law to give people the confidence their cases will be heard in due time. But we're also doing what we can to toughen the penalties for those men, and I'm afraid it is overwhelmingly men, who commit these crimes. And I think it would have been a good thing if last night the whole House could have voted for tougher sentences for those who commit sexual and violence offences and stop people, Mr. Speaker, from being released early. And in that collegiate spirit, I would ask him to work together with us.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I was Director of Public Prosecution for 5 years and spent every day prosecuting serious crime, including terrorism, sexual violence and rape. So I really don't need lectures about how to enforce the criminal law. But walking on through the system, as many women and girls have to do, and facing up to the challenges that we need to face up to as a House, the next challenge is the point the Prime Minister just referenced, and that's the sentences for rape and sexual violence, because they need to be toughened. Let me give the House 3 examples. John Patrick, convicted of raping a 13-year-old girl, he received a 7-year sentence. Orlando and Constanzo, convicted of raping a woman in a nightclub, they received a 7.5-year sentence. James Reeve, convicted of raping a 7-year-old girl, he received a 9-year sentence. Does the Prime Minister agree we need urgently to look at this and to toughen sentences for rape and serious sexual violence?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, wouldn't it be a wonderful thing if there was a bill going through the House of Commons which did exactly that? Wouldn't it be a wonderful thing if there were measures to defend women and girls from violent and sex criminals? Wouldn't it be a wonderful thing if there was a bill before the House to have tougher sentences for child murderers and tougher punishments for sex offenders? That, I think, would be a fine thing, Mr. Speaker. As it happens, there is such a bill before the House. I think it would be a great thing if the right honourable gentleman actually had voted for it. He still has time. This bill is still before the House. He can lift his opposition. They actually voted against it, Mr. Speaker, on a 3-line whip, and I think it was crazy.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, he mentions the bill last night. That provided for longer maximum sentences for damaging a memorial than the sentences imposed in the 3 cases of rape I've referred the House to. All of those sentences less than 10 years. I thank the Prime Minister for providing me with the best examples of why the priorities in his bill were so wrong. And nothing in that bill would have increased the length of sentence in any of those rape cases. Nothing in that bill. But let me try to return to the constructive spirit, because I think that is demanded of all of us. If this House came together on the points raised today, and there's been agreement across the dispatch boxes, it would make a real difference to victims of crime. This week, Labour published a 10-point plan. We published a victims' law. In coming days, we're going to publish amendments in relation to the criminal justice system to make it work better. Now, I don't expect the Prime Minister to agree with all of this, and frankly, I don't care if this becomes a government bill or Conservative legislation. All I care about is whether we make progress. So will the Prime Minister meet me, the Shadow Home Secretary, the Honourable Member for Birmingham Yardley and victims groups who've spent many years campaigning on this, so that we can really and truly make this a turning point?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid that he does, and I'm grateful to him for the collegiate speech, the way in which he's addressing this, and the way in which he's reaching out across the chamber. And I think that's entirely right in the circumstances. But I do think that he should not misrepresent what the bill was trying to do. The average sentence for rape is already 9 years, 9 months, as he knows full well. The maximum sentence is already life. What we were trying to do is stiffen the sentences for a variety of offences to protect women and girls and others. And that is entirely the right thing to do, Mr. Speaker. And we will go on with our agenda, delivering on the people's priorities, rolling out more police, 7,000 we have already, investing in ISVAs and IDVAs, and doing our utmost to accelerate the processes, the grinding processes of the criminal justice system, which, as he rightly says, are such a deterrent to women in coming forward to complain as they rightly should. But until we sort out that fundamental problem, until women feel that they are being heard and their voices are being heard and their complaints are being addressed by society, we will not fix this problem. And I warmly welcome what he suggests about wanting to fix it together, and I hope that in that spirit he can bring himself to vote for the tougher sentences that we've set out.
Just to say, we've got to be a little bit careful because nobody will misrepresent each other in this House. Steve Double.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for bringing the G7 Leaders Summit to Cornwall this summer? This will put Cornwall front and centre of the world stage as we emerge from the pandemic and give us a great opportunity to showcase all that Cornwall has to offer, not just as a great place to visit and our amazing food and drink sector, but in the technologies of the future in space and renewable energy. I know the Prime Minister shares my ambition that the G7 will leave a lasting economic legacy for the people of Cornwall. So to that end, and in light of the recent progress made on lithium extraction, would he work with me to secure a gigafactory for Cornwall so that we can produce the batteries, leave that lasting economic legacy and provide the well-paid jobs for the future that Cornwall needs?
Yes.
Prime Minister.
Yes, of course, Mr. Speaker. I think Cornwall is the Klondike of lithium, as far as I understand the matter, and I'll be delighted to assist him in locating a gigafactory somewhere near Cornwall, Mr. Speaker. But I don't want to promise too much at this stage.
Let's go to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I wish everyone a happy St Patrick's Day. Mr. Speaker, for people across Scotland, this week again exposed a tale of two governments with two very different sets of values. Yesterday, the SNP government passed landmark legislation that will put the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into Scots law, putting children at the vanguard of children's rights. In contrast, we have a UK government that has to be shamed into providing free school meals, that will clap for nurses but won't give them a fair wage, and ploughs billions into a nuclear arsenal that sits redundant on the Clyde. Does the Prime Minister understand that the Scottish people are best served with a government that lives up to their values? A government, Prime Minister, that prioritises bairns, not bombs.
Prime Minister.
I think what the people of Scotland need and deserve, Mr. Speaker, is a government that tackles the problems of education in Scotland, that addresses itself to fighting crime and drug addiction in Scotland, and a government in Scotland that weans itself off its addiction to constitutional change and constitutional argument, and he seems determined to call in the middle of a pandemic when the country is trying to move forward together, seems determined and obsessed with nothing else, Mr. Speaker, nothing else than breaking up the country and a reckless referendum.
Ian Blackford. Ian.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Of course, this is Prime Minister's questions. The Prime Minister, maybe just once, might start to try and answer a question that's put to him, because we're talking about a Tory plan to impose a 40% increase in nuclear warheads. Our children have the right to a future that no longer lives under the shadow of these weapons of mass destruction. As the Irish president said on this St. Patrick's Day, surely we need to find ways to make peace, not war. Every single one of these weapons will be based on the Clyde. So can the Prime Minister tell us exactly when the Scottish people gave him the moral or democratic authority to impose these weapons of mass destruction on our soil in Scotland?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the people of Scotland contribute enormously to the health, happiness, well-being and security of this entire country, not least through their contribution to our science, our defences, our international aid and many, many other ways. And I'm very proud that this government is investing record sums in defence, including maintaining our nuclear defence, which is absolutely vital for our long-term security, and helping thereby to drive jobs not just in Scotland, but across the whole of the UK.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Back in July last year, I informed the Prime Minister of the need for a new hospital in Doncaster. Sadly, Doncaster was not mentioned in the first 40 hospitals promised in the manifesto, but the building of a further 8 specialist hospitals was. Yet does my right honourable friend agree with me that a new hospital will prove to the people of Doncaster that this government is committed to building back better and levelling up their town?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is a fantastic advocate of Doncaster, and he's right to campaign in the way that he does. I wish I could give him a cut and dried yes or no answer today, but I can tell him that his local trust is very much in the running in the current open competition for the next 8 hospitals on top of the 40, Mr. Speaker, that we're already building.
Let's go to Caroline Lucas. Caroline.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The creation of a no protest zone around Parliament, a 266% increase from a maximum 3 months to 11 months imprisonment for protest organisers, a direct attack on the Gypsy, Roma and traveller community, up to 10 years in prison for any offence committed by destroying or damaging a memorial, and criminalising people for taking part in protests where they ought to have known police conditions were in place. Would the Prime Minister agree that if the UK is to be a force for good, in a world where democracy is in retreat, as his Foreign Secretary is saying today, it needs to start at home with the protection of the long-standing, precious and fundamental right to peaceful protest that is a cornerstone of liberal democracy?
Prime Minister.
She is quite right to stick up for peaceful protest, and I understand that, and I sympathise with that. But there are a couple of points. First of all, we're facing a pandemic, Mr. Speaker, in which we have to restrict, alas, we have to restrict human contact, and although she shakes her head, I think that the people of this country do understand that. They do understand the restrictions that we're now under. And I think we also have to strike a balance between the need to allow peaceful protest to go ahead, and we do, on a huge scale in this country, but also to protect free speech, Mr. Speaker, and vital parts of the UK economy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I also want to see the fundamental right to protest protected, so events such as that powerful vigil last Saturday on Clapham Common can proceed safely, including COVID safe. But I also want to see measures so people can go about their lives, get to work, get to hospital without being hindered. So can the Prime Minister reassure me that that police and crime bill, which we've been discussing today and was in the House yesterday, does strike that balance, whilst also taking action against the perpetrators of some of the worst crimes?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend has perfectly summed up the balance that we're trying to strike between allowing people in a reasonable way to go about their daily lives, but also bringing in tougher sentences for child murderers, tougher punishments for sex offenders, and stopping the practice, the continual practice of allowing people out early, Mr. Speaker. I think that's what the people of this country want to see. That's what they voted for in 2019, and I hope that the opposition can bring themselves one day to support it.
Charlotte Nettle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the government's end-to-end rape review remaining unpublished 2 years after it was promised, rape conviction rates having fallen to their lowest point on record, and almost 90% of sexual harassment complaints not even reported to the police. Women are increasingly being left without legal recourse for sexual violence. I have parliamentary privilege. I can name the men who have hurt me. But millions of women in this country don't even have that. Stuck between a criminal system where only 1.4% of reported offences result in charges being laid, and where too many survivors who speak out are pursued through the civil courts by their abusers to silence them, can the Prime Minister advise how women are meant to get justice?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid that she's completely right, and I know that she speaks for many people, many women up and down the country. And what we need to do, we can do all the things that we've talked about, two men arguing over the dispatch box. We can do all those things. We can bring in more laws, tougher sentences, which I hope she will support. We can support independent domestic violence and sexual violence advisors, all that kind of thing. But we have to address the fundamental issue of the casual, everyday sexism and apathy that fails to address the concerns of women. That is the underlying issue.
Let's go to Fiona Bruce. Fiona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 years ago, the Bishop of Truro produced an interim report outlining the global phenomenon of persecution of Christians. As we make progress in our manifesto commitment to fully implement the Truro Review recommendations, does the Prime Minister join me in looking forward to our hosting the International Ministerial Conference on Freedom of Religion or Belief next year, and to the UK demonstrating its global leadership in defending and promoting this universal right for all?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend very much for everything that she's doing to campaign for freedom of religion and belief, and I'm very pleased that we're going to be holding an international conference on this issue. That is exactly what Global Britain is all about. It's about promoting freedom of expression, freedom of belief and religion.
Let's go to Peter Grant. Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister refused point blank to answer the question from my right honourable friend from Ross Skye and Lochaber. So I'll ask him again. What is it that gives any British Prime Minister the moral and democratic right to impose the obscenity of an even bigger arsenal of weapons of mass murder on the people of Scotland against their express will?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think that was a veiled attempt again by the SNP to ask for another referendum, which is their habitual refrain. That is all they seem able to talk about, democratic wrangling about democracy and their desire to be separated and to break up the country. I don't think that's the right way forward. I think we need strong defences. That's what the people of this country voted for, and that's what we're going to deliver.
Let's go to Steve Bride. Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From gloom to joy, and news from the Winchester for the Prime Minister is that the vaccination programme is going really, really well. There are now less than 200,000 people in the whole of Hampshire and the Isle of Wight left to do in cohorts 1 to 9. And we have the plan plus the supply to cover them comfortably by the end of March. So would my right honourable friend please thank the NHS and its volunteers here for this amazing effort. And as he does that, could he share with us his view on what led to the disinformation and apparent abandonment of scientific evidence in certain EU member states around the Oxford AstraZeneca jab?
Prime Minister.
I thank the NHS in Hampshire and indeed around the country for the amazing job that they're doing in rolling out the vaccination programme. It's been truly stunning, and I think perhaps the best thing I can say about the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine programme is that I finally got news that I'm going to have my own jab, Mr. Speaker, very, very shortly. I'm pleased to discover I don't know whether the right honourable gentleman's had his. He's had his, but it will certainly be Oxford AstraZeneca that I will be having.
Let's go to Geraint Davies. Geraint.
Mr. Speaker, there's now been over 600 cases of coronavirus infections at DVLA Swansea since September. Yet ministers still refuse to meet with the PCS union to discuss ways in which more workers can work from home in safety before they're vaccinated. So workers have now resorted to voting for strike action as a last resort to protect their families and communities. So I ask the Prime Minister again, will he now instruct ministers to engage in talks with the union to help shield vulnerable workers before vaccination, or will he force a needless strike?
Prime Minister.
Well, I think needless is the right word, Mr. Speaker, and I think he should bear in mind that any strike is likely to be bad news for motorists. We're at the stage now where we want to have advancing down our roadmap out of lockdown, and at the DVLA, any staff who can work from home are doing so. And currently, out of a workforce of 6,000, only 5 cases of COVID have currently been found, and I understand that those individuals are all working from home. So frankly, Mr. Speaker, I see no need for industrial action.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My Kensington constituents and I have been deeply troubled by what is coming out of the Grenfell inquiry with regard to the building products industry. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that contractors who have behaved improperly should not be used going forward for government contracts? And will my right honourable friend consider a tax on the building products industry in the same way as we've done on the residential property sector as a way for partly paying for cladding remediation?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, and I know how much she cares about this issue and how deeply her constituents have been affected by the Grenfell fire. And what I can say to her, I will study her proposal for a new tax on building materials, and I know my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, will want to think about that kind of idea. But we are looking at new rules to exclude contractors from government business where gross professional negligence has been shown, Mr. Speaker.
Let's go to Richard Bergen. Richard.
Exactly 1 year ago today, we were told that 20,000 coronavirus deaths would be, and I quote, a good outcome. Yet our death toll is now 6 times higher. Over 100,000 more people have lost their lives than that initial estimate. In March last year, the Prime Minister pontificated about taking it on the chin. Others acted decisively with lockdowns. But the Prime Minister dithered and delayed with deadly consequences. With the worst hopefully now behind us, isn't it time for the Prime Minister to hold up his hands and come clean with the British public and say, those deaths are on me, and for that, I apologise?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I certainly take full responsibility for everything the government did, and of course we mourn the loss of every single coronavirus victim, and we sympathise deeply with their families and their loved ones. And am I sorry for what has happened to our country? Yes, of course, I'm deeply, deeply sorry, Mr. Speaker. And of course, there will be time for a full inquiry to enable us all to understand what we need to do better when we face these problems in the future. And that is something I think the whole House shares.
Let's go to Dr. Neil Hudson. Neil.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 5 years on from Storm Desmond and a year on from Storm Ciara, sadly, Penrith and the Border and Cumbria remain in the front line for severe flooding events. With climate change, these catastrophes are becoming increasingly frequent and severe, and the effects on communities are serious and long-term. Can my right honourable friend reassure my constituents that at-risk communities will be supported by government, both in terms of flood protection, but also with the longer-term support, including in the important area of help for the mental health impacts of flooding?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend makes a really good point about the mental health impacts of flooding. Anybody who goes to, or who's been a victim of flooding, or who visits a family that's been hit by flooding will know the immense distress that flooding causes, and that's why the NHS will get an extra £500 million to address those issues and to give more support for the mental health needs that people have.
Liz Twist.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister, in December 2019's election campaign, you visited Samantha Parker at her home in Darlington. Samantha has the rare genetic condition PKU. You vowed to do your utmost to get her access to the life-changing drug Kuvan on the NHS.
Use you, I'm not responsible. Thank you.
Apologies. Prime Minister vowed to do his utmost to get her access to the life-changing drug Kuvan. Last month, NICE published draft guidance which would make Kuvan available to children, but not to adults like Samantha. Great for children, but devastating and discriminatory for adults like Samantha. Prime Minister, speaking as chair of the APPG on PKU, I now ask, what action will you take to deliver on your commitment to Samantha Parker and make Kuvan available for her and for other adults with PKU?
Prime Minister.
I thank her very much for raising the case, which I well remember. I'm glad that NICE has now extended the treatment's availability to children with PKU. Clearly, we need to do more, and I will be very happy to take it up.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Has my right honourable friend noted that the integrated review has been widely and rightly welcomed as a bold British vision for our role in the world? At the same time, but not in Scotland, of course, where the Nationalist administration thinks it's more important to put IndyRef 2 on the ballot paper at the Scottish elections. Does he realise that they are rejecting the jobs and security that his review guarantees in Scotland because they hate the UK more than they want jobs for their own people?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for his support for the integrated review. I think that it's hard to know what motivates our friends in the Scottish National Party, but I do think that they're mistaken in their approach to this. I think that we're better as one United Kingdom. I think that we're stronger together as one United Kingdom, and I think the contribution of the people of Scotland to the defence of our United Kingdom is absolutely incredible and has been for centuries, and that's what I want to maintain, and I think it's a fine thing, and they should champion it.
Let's go to Tahir Halley. Tahir. Tahir Halley.
Throughout the last year, NHS staff have been working tirelessly to keep our communities healthy and safe during the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask the Prime Minister, why has he been economical with the truth when he says that a 1% pay increase is all the government can afford?
Can I just say no honourable member on any side would actually mislead or lie to the House, but I'm sure the Prime Minister could answer something.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, I'm grateful for your clarification, because what we're doing is we're saying that we so value the incredible contribution of nurses to our country over the last year or more, that we want them, exceptionally of all the public services, to be looked at for a pay increase at a time of real difficulty in the public finances, which I think people do understand. Now, that's on top of the 12.8% increase in starting salary for nurses, plus the £5,000 bursary and the £3,000 that we've given for special help for childcare and other training needs, and which actually are leading, if he looks at the figures, they're leading to a big increase in the number of nurses in the NHS, 10,600 more this year than last year, more nurses in the NHS, and 60,000 more in training. And when I talk to nurses, what they want, of course everybody wants better pay and conditions, I totally understand that, but what they also want is an extra pair of hands next to them to give them the help and reassurance they need, and that's what we're recruiting.
Nikki.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recent horrific events have brought the important debate on women and girls' rights into the spotlight, and specifically their right to be safe and feel safe as they go about their daily lives. Does my right honourable friend agree that such issues need to be treated sensitively? And false claims made by the Labour Party last night on social media about the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Bill are misleading and certainly not helpful.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think it was certainly a mistake, and a regrettable mistake, for anybody to suggest that rape had been decriminalised in this country, because we must do everything we can to reassure victims of rape and sexual violence and get them to come forward. And that is what we're doing. And I also think it would be a good thing if together we could vote for some of the tougher sentences that we put forward in this bill. And I like the collegiate spirit that we had earlier on. I hope it can be extended to voting for the tougher sentences that we put forward.
Final question, Gerald Jones.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Today, the Welsh Labour Government have announced a special bonus payment for NHS and social care staff in Wales, with the Welsh Government covering the basic tax and national insurance payments so that most people will receive around £500. Will the Prime Minister today join me in welcoming this payment in recognition of the dedication and commitment of our NHS and social care staff?
Prime Minister.
I thank him, and I do indeed recognise the amazing dedication and commitment of NHS and social care staff who have been at the forefront of this pandemic, who have borne the brunt of it in many cases personally in their lives. And that's why I just repeat the point that I made a while ago about what we're doing to recognise the contribution of nurses in particular, alone of all the public sector in these very, very difficult times, and to say how relieved and glad I am to see the number of nurses who are now in training. I think there's a 34% increase in applications to be nurses this year in the country. That's great, but we're going to drive it forward, Mr. Speaker. We want to go, as you know, we have a target of 50,000 more nurses as well as 20,000 more police.
I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes.
That brings us to the end of this week's Prime Minister's questions. Unsurprisingly, the questions and the exchanges between Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer focused wholly on the political and societal response following the killing of Sarah Everard and what can be done to better protect women and girls and make them feel safer on our streets. Let's introduce guests for this part of the programme. Welcome Nigel Huddleston, Minister for Sport and Tourism for the government, Alison McGovern, the Shadow Minister for Sport and Culture for the Labour Party, and Laura Kuenssberg, the BBC's political editor. Laura, there has been disquiet over the tone that has been engaged when talking about these issues, and obviously we saw those scenes at the weekend at the vigil for Sarah Everard. There did seem to be an attempt by both Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson in what the Prime Minister called a collegiate spirit. There was a bit of a divergence, though, when it comes to what the response should actually be and what the legislative answer is.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think they both chose deliberately to speak calmly, to speak seriously, to try, at least theoretically, to find common ground, both agreeing that the awful events of the last week should be seen as something of a turning point in terms of how society looks at attacks and violence against women. As you suggest, though, what they didn't then agree on at all is what the right approach is. Labour voted against some of the government's measures last night. Boris Johnson wanted to criticise them for doing that. Keir Starmer wanted to say, defend the Labour position on that. And they do not agree on what the right next steps are. So while they were both happy from a political point of view to say this is serious, we both agree that, let's do something about it, the actual measures in practice is something there isn't political agreement on at all. Just briefly also, I think what will also get journalists busy this afternoon is the Prime Minister's own revelation that he's been called to have his vaccine at the age of 56, I think. Interesting, he made a point, I wonder why, that he will be having the AstraZeneca vaccine, just as the EU is in another real froth about their problems getting the vaccine rollout going. I wonder, though, how the Prime Minister knows which kind of vaccine he'll be having.
I know. I wonder if he's been told ahead of time,
Special
unlike the rest of us. And I think people over 50 now can actually go ahead and book their own appointments to be vaccinated with AstraZeneca or anything else.
That's right. That's been confirmed this morning. Big news, of course, for probably lots of people watching. If you are over 50, you can now absolutely go ahead and get your vaccine as that rollout extends further and further down the age range and further across the population.
And that includes me, the young age for the over 50s.
Goodness.
Yes, it does. Alison, let's return to some of the measures that were proposed by Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's questions. A series of changes in the law on street harassment, stalking and rights for victims. What is Labour asking for?
So Keir mentioned at PMQs actually that he brought forward this idea of a victims law.
Yes.
So that many years ago, and it was recently reintroduced by Peter Kyle, who's our Shadow Victims Minister. Reason being that often people don't know their rights as a victim, and often those rights and that position in law, is not taken up by all the very many parts of government that you need to respond. So the law would introduce, more information for victim about their rights and more responsibility on all the different authorities to respond to the needs of victims. I mean, just to give a practical example, I see lots of constituents who've dealt with domestic violence where the police have dealt with their case well, but then they have issues dealing with local council or other things. So we need the whole system to respond much better to people who are victims of violence, and that's particularly women.
Should that be taken up, Nigel?
Well, there is an end-to-end review of rape cases actually taking place at the moment, but it's really important that we do all show that we are on the side of victims. And I say, unfortunately, we had a golden opportunity across all sides of the House to show that last night, and Labour decided to vote against a bill that would have shown that we're on the side of the victims for all sorts of reasons. So I think rhetoric's one thing, and I think the tone today was right, and hopefully Ali and I, who generally get on many things, will probably continue that tone. But, the saying one thing and doing another, I think people see straight through that.
Alison?
People also see straight through a bill that contained measures in it that, are completely disproportionate in terms of the restriction to free expression. Why put that in a bill that also had things in that Labour MPs would support if you actually want to get it through with maximum support in the Commons? I mean, I just don't understand why you do that. Okay, let's turn a page, let's stop the politicking and get on with it. We can do that. We also need measures, for example, to make sure that police monitor misogyny as a hate crime. There's some fundamental structural things that have got to change in this country.
All right.
And we want to see action on that.
Alison, I just want to show our viewers this tweet from the Labour Party. In fact, it was referred to by one of the MPs during Prime Minister's questions. It says, under the Tories, rape has effectively been decriminalised. We need to do so much more to end violence against women and girls. And the tweet goes on, as you can see, to quote official figures, showing that well over 50,000 rapes are reported to the police, but that only leads to charges in fewer than 2,000 cases. Now, these figures are shocking. We covered this graph and statistical evidence yesterday. But should the Labour Party be putting out a message that rape is effectively decriminalised in this country? Boris Johnson called it a regrettable mistake.
That message came from the Victims Commissioner, who's a government appointee. I would say that women in this country understand the situation that we face, and it is very, very serious. And saying to people, "Oh, you must come forward," sounds a bit like putting the blame on those who are victims. And I don't think that's the right approach. I think the right approach is for us all to say, we will work together to improve those statistics. And that is why the Labour Party is putting forward a plan to do that.
Right.
And as I say, we can all criticise each other for politics. If we really want to turn the page, then, as Keir said in PMQs, let's get Jess Phillips, Keir Starmer, both of whom are extraordinarily experienced in this field, round the table with the ministers, and let's do it. We can all point the finger and say, "Oh, you're just politicking." Okay, action, not words then. Let's have action.
All right, well, let's look at the figures then, Nigel. As I said, over 55,000 rapes were recorded by the police in England and Wales last year, and it led to only 2,000 or so prosecutions, and that's resulted in just over 1,000 rape convictions last year, or nearly 1,500 rape convictions last year. How do you explain those figures?
Well, look, I don't think there's any denying that they're not good enough. We want to see improvements there, which is exactly why...
It's worse than that, though, isn't it?
Well, it's exactly why we're conducting a review, because I think it is really important that we send the message out that we want people to both report rape cases and then make sure that we actually have processes in place to make sure that we get convictions. There's an absolute sincere commitment to that. Nobody's objecting to that. But this typology that Ali was just doing, trying to, quite frankly, score party political points, and I don't think any of our constituents will like that. But it's really important that we do get the message across. We take rape cases incredibly seriously. And I say, look, let's remember, this government, we're the ones bringing in the domestic abuse bill. We've taken action on many other areas, including upskirting and stalking.
Sure.
These are actions that are being taken. So we are making progress, and nobody's denying that we need to make further progress. That's why we're doing the review.
But Minister, do you really need a review, though, to tell you that one of the reasons these figures are scandalously low is actually years of pressure on court budgets, years of pressure on the Department of Justice budgets, and it's very easy politicians start trading blows over new offences. But one of the huge issues here is the fact that the system has been under such pressure because the Department of Justice budget has been whacked over the last decade. Do you really need a review to tell you that?
Well, look, I say there's an absolute sincere commitment from both sides of the chamber to make sure we make progress here. If you talk to Vicky Atkins, and I know you have, there's absolutely commitment there. I say, look, I think there's recognition. We haven't got it all right in the past. We need to make progress, but there is an absolute sincere commitment.
But do you accept that one of the reasons that this is such a problem is that many parts of the justice system have been creaking because they had such an amount of resource taken out of it? I mean, anybody who works in this field would tell you that sort of straight away, that that is a huge part of the problem before you even get to discussing whether or not new offences would make any difference.
Look, there's no doubt resources is a really important part of this. So is messaging, and so are actually the rules, the regulations and the crimes and the sentencing as well. So I say we did have a golden opportunity last night for the whole of the House to come together and send the right messaging out. And then with tweets and other things, I think Labour got it wrong. I don't know how they can go to their constituents and explain the actions that they took last night. I think it's going to be a very difficult job to explain that.
Alison?
Oh, well, I can explain those actions. That bill said more about protecting statues than it said about women. And as I said before, if you really want to get a bill through with maximum support on both sides of the House, then don't put measures in it that disproportionately restrict freedom of expression. So let's move on to the actual issue. As I said before, I think it is the wrong thing to say to people, you must come forward, when women are not stupid. Women know all of those things that Laura just mentioned about what the situation is in the court system after years and years of cuts. Women know how the legal system works. We see this being reported all the time. So what we need is a society that takes responsibility for misogyny, a society that takes hate crime against women seriously, and then puts in place the system and resources. And you know,
but is that tweet last night going to encourage women to come forward? I don't think so. It wasn't helpful, and you know that.
Well, I think that I understand very well the position of women and what makes them come forward or not. I think what we need is for the whole of society to take responsibility here. And the bit that the government can do is to take very seriously the suggestions from the opposition and try to work with them on that. And I think that is what women in this country need to see now.
Right, but
I think we did see that in the tone from the Prime Minister today. There is a willingness across the House to cooperate here.
You can let me have the last word. I mean, I think that we should be really careful here to get this right, and we need the government to take seriously the plan that the opposition will put forward.
Right, I've got 2 points to put to both of you. I mean, there is an issue of messaging, isn't there, Alison? And that is the criticism here, that anything that could deter victims of rape from coming forward, when they hear a trusted source like the Labour Party saying that rape is effectively decriminalised, is not going to progress this.
That message came from the Victims Commissioner, and
yeah,
I think that,
you
as I said before, like women are realistic. I think that we've over the past week we've set out what we need to change, you know, and I think we do have to be realistic. What needs to change is a culture where misogyny is not taken as seriously as it should be. You know, we haven't talked about also the role of education, and not just education of children and young people, but how we move our whole country on so that people understand underlying situation that women in this country face.
All right.
So, yeah, I'm sure that the Tory party, Tory MP, criticise the Labour Party.
But,
yeah,
Alison, were you really comfortable with a comment that was made by Vera Baird, very well-respected, experienced figure, made in the context of a longer quote that she was giving about the scandal of the prosecution figures? Are you really comfortable as an experienced MP with that being slapped onto a very crude computer graphic that had in bold letters sending out a message online to women that rape has been decriminalised? Because those two things are very different kinds of messages, aren't they? Were you really comfortable with that?
I'm very comfortable that people should listen to Vera Baird.
That's not my question. My question is, were you comfortable as Labour Party putting that out there in such a crude way?
Yeah, similarly, Laura, I think as you've seen from this discussion, we all know that the reality is that the Tory party will criticise the Labour Party and the Labour Party will criticise the Tory party. But in the conversation about the substance, I think that there, as you mentioned before, I think there is a difference of view about the way forward. And what we need now is to look at how we get to the underlying issues of misogyny. That's part one on education and what the police do to monitor and track that. And then we need to look at all of the things that Keir mentioned today on sentencing. And as you were talking about before, about the structure of the court system, how it's funded and how it works.
All right.
So that is the serious job of work that needs to be done.
All right. Before we leave it, though, Nigel, the reason that we're having a discussion about this is because after being in government for nearly 11 years, the official figures do suggest that only a tiny fraction of rapists ever face justice in this country. Why is that happening?
Well, as I said at the beginning, and as the Prime Minister has said as well, we need to do more.
Yeah, but why is that the case? Why is that the case?
Well, rape cases are incredibly complex, and building the evidence base can be incredibly complex. It always has been, actually. It always has been, but we need to make sure that we do more there. It's good that more women are coming forward and reporting rape cases. We need to encourage that, and which is why I say I don't think last night's Twitter activity helped in any way, shape or form. Yeah, but I know, but it speaks to the whole aspect here. We need to encourage women to come forward, and then, yes, we need to improve the processes in the system so that we get more convictions.
All right.
And we need to send that message out that we actually want women to come forward, and yes, we will be doing more. And as I said, there is a review tackling exactly this issue. We're not ignorant to the problems here.
We're going to return to this, obviously, on another occasion. We've only got a few minutes left, and I want to talk to you about your brief, Nigel, and of course you shadow as well. In terms of culture and sport and the unlocking of restrictions, when will we see events like football matches and theatrical productions going ahead without any social distancing restrictions at all?
Well, we've got a programme as outlined by the Prime Minister, and the events research programme is now already up and running. We've got a bunch of pilot test events for a whole range of events, from sporting events to, probably comedy clubs to music events and so on planned. Those will help inform the decision making, and that will be reporting back. And the goal is to get more events opening on the 17th of May, and then by the 21st of June, or from the 21st of June, we do want to have far more events opening without social distancing.
Right.
So that's why these pilot events are so important.
Right. So from the 21st of June, can I clarify, is the plan that stadiums, football stadiums and theatres will be full, operating exactly as they did before the pandemic?
Well, it's all based on conditions and making sure that we progress in the way that the Prime Minister outlined a few weeks ago. And of course, these pilot programmes will be a learning experience, but it's definitely an ambition, and we want to get there. The country wants to get there. These businesses want to start earning money again because they've gone through a very, very difficult time. So yes, it is, but let's be clear, it is a goal, it is our aim, but it is conditional on making progress at every stage.
Alison, do you support that timetable?
Yes, we have to put the public health imperative first, of course, but thanks to the brilliant public servants operating the vaccine programme and, frankly, all of the public servants in the NHS, we're well placed. So put public health first, but let's get on with it, because people, are desperate to get back in a football stadium, speaking frankly. The other side of it I would like to see is to make sure that that our kids are playing sport as well at the same time. And I think we've got more work to do to make sure that schools have got enough space for that, and to make sure that, young people whose well-being has, it's really suffered over lockdown are also able to get back to doing dance and drama, and make sure we take, as much participation as possible in a safe way as soon as we can as well.
All right, and just very briefly, because I want to come back to Laura before we finish the programme. Nigel, vaccine passports, yes or no?
Well, again, that's going to be part of the consideration, both in terms of the international travel, because, we've got a global travel task force looking at that, and then also, yes, we're considering all options, as you would expect it to be.
Yes or no, Alison?
Yes.
Yes. OK, well, good. Well done, you. So Alison wants to get back in the football stadium. I mean, it's interesting. It's an aspiration, as Nigel said. It's an ambition.
And remember, with the roadmap, to use the jargon that the country is now on, in England at least, but same in Scotland, it's all dependent on what happens with the spread of coronavirus. And the English roadmap has got 5-week delays between each stage.
Yes.
And there are, as the Minister mentioned, these task force looking at travel, looking at sport. And there's still an awful lot of way to go before these decisions can actually be firm ones. So, you know, you can hear them both there, trying to look forward without being completely and utterly sure.
That's all we've got time for. Thank you to all of my guests. I'll be back tomorrow at 12:15.